Welcome. Today's webinar is Why to Hire an Editor and What to Expect When You Do. It is presented by Lynn Malcolm. I'm your host. My name is Anna Cairns, and thank you for joining us. Lynn has been writing and editing for over 30 years. She started as a freelance journalist and soon found a niche in magazine editing. She worked as a communications consultant for a dozen years, primarily for nonprofits, small nonprofits, during which she served as contributing writer and managing editor of half a dozen quarterly in-house publications. In recent years, she has focused increasingly on editing books for conventional and hybrid publishers and emerging authors seeking help with their first manuscript. Lynn holds certificates in writing, editing, and publishing through Simon Fraser University's Writing and Publishing program, and in 2015, she earned a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative nonfiction writing from University of King's College in Halifax. She is currently working on her first book, and welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Anna. Let me get things up here. Thank you very much, Anna. As Anna said, my name is Lynn Malcolm. I'm a writer and editor, and this is my webinar, Why Hire an Editor and What to Expect When You Do. Before we dive in, I want to let you know that I'm very open to questions. They always make everything more interesting. And I will periodically stop to ask for questions, so please save your questions for those pauses. They do happen at regular intervals. Also, I just want to note that I first created what was originally a workshop for self-publishing authors. So you may see some of that audience sort of creeping through there, but the content applies across the board. So if you're attending on behalf of a corporation, a government department, a nonprofit agency, and you're not sure how the content applies in your situation, please feel free to ask during one of those pauses. Okay, let's move right in. In this webinar, you're going to learn what an editor does, how to find a good editor, and what to expect from the editing process, including what to pay. Now, a few years ago, I went to see a doctor. It was a specialist. I'd never seen him before. And you know how doctors at the beginning will do a little bit of ice-breaking conversation. So in the course of that, he asked me what I did for a living, and I said an editor. And he said something to the effect that, well, I must only work with beginning writers because, you know, once you get to a certain point, you don't need an editor anymore. Before I tell you what I said to him, I'm going to show you a couple of images. So admittedly, the people who wrote these notices was probably not a Pulitzer Prize winning author, but that notwithstanding, and what I said to that doctor was, maybe the question should be, who doesn't need an editor? Everybody needs an editor. Margaret Atwood has an editor. I can think of only one book that by repute was not edited, and that was Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking. And if you want to know why it wasn't edited, I'll tell you in the questions. The thing is, an editor can bring objectivity to your content and the way you present it. An editor can see when something you think is straightforward actually needs more explanation. Depending on what you're writing, an editor may have knowledge you lack. A few years ago, a friend and colleague of mine was sending her first novel to print. And at the 11th hour, her editor wasn't able to do the final proofread, so she asked me if I would do it. And I think that we both ended up really glad that that had happened, because Although most of her book was in an area, it was set in the horse racing world. She knew a lot about it. It was a really good novel. The very end brought in something to do with family services. And well, I have a background in family services. My ex-husband has a background in family services. My older sister, my older daughter. In other words, it's family services is kind of the family business in our family. So I recognized that this information that she had brought in had not been researched, and I was able to help her correct it before it went to print. You will run into that all the time. Editors read a lot, obviously. They typically have very wide knowledge of a lot of things, and so that's another one of the things that an editor can bring to your writing. Then there's an issue with our brains very kindly making corrections for us. I don't think there's a particular name for this phenomenon, but when the human brain sees patterns and sees them more than once, they start to fill in any blanks. So what you see is the pattern that you're familiar with without any blanks or mistakes. This explains why perhaps when you were in university, you would hand in an essay thinking it was free of typos, grammatical mistakes, whatever, and then you'd get it back whatever amount of time later. You'd take a look at it with fresh eyes and you'd realize that there were actually several typos. And you'd wonder how that could possibly have happened. Well, that's why that happens. Yes?
I'm getting a lot of messages here that there is no screen share. Have you started your screen share?
Yes, I have.
We don't have that up yet.
Okay.
Can you just try that again?
Yeah, I'm trying. And I'm going to have to stop the slideshow for a minute.
Are you using your Zoom screen share at the bottom of your video window?
Hold on one second.
Do you want to stop sharing the screen and start again?
That's what I'm. Okay.
I do apologize. We did go through this during the practice run, and we were having issues with the screen share. And it seems that is continuing. If you just give us a moment, please. There we go.
Sorry about that, everyone.
That's okay. We're on your full. We're seeing the entire screen there. There you go.
Is that better?
Much better. Thank you so much.
Okay, I apologize for that. This is my first webinar. So I saw in the comments that for some of you, this is your first webinar, so I apologize for the glitches. Okay, so picking up where we left off, the article at this link, don't worry about copying it down because you'll get a PDF in the recording. But it is one of several articles that you can find on the web which explain this phenomenon and how to get around it. And there are tricks for getting around this, which I will come to later. Bottom line, a good editor, I should say, is a writer's best friend. Many novice writers think an editor's job is simply to correct grammar and typos, but in reality, that's only a very small portion of the job. An editor's goal is to help you produce your best work. An editor helps you balance what you want to write with what will be the most meaningful to your reader. And those two things are not always the same. A good editor knows the difference and can help you achieve a balance using your voice and your story. Now, I was at a presentation a number of years ago where the presenter said that research shows that If you have opportunities to laugh during a presentation, you will remember the material better, even if the things you're laughing at are not connected to the content. Well, I've done my best to gather some tidbits about writing and editing that will help you laugh, and that will also be cues for you to ask any questions. So, Anna, do we have any questions so far?
We really do. We have a few here, actually. They're all about the slides so far. Just a moment. Yes, Dalton, there is a PDF and a slideshow that will be sent out at the time that the video is sent out. So not to worry, you'll have all the slides. And that's what they're all about. Just about
Okay.
the slides, not to worry.
All right, then. We will move right along. One of the first questions a good editor should ask you is, who is your audience? No matter what you're writing, you must clearly and fairly narrowly define to whom you are trying to speak. If you try too hard to reach everyone, you'll reach no one. And as an editor, I run into this all the time, that people think that everyone will want to read what they're writing. And you know, maybe what they're writing could serve a lot of different people. But the point is that you have to aim towards a specific audience and allow the other people to find you on their own terms. So, audience determines key things like length of words, sentences, paragraphs, and chapters. You determine your overall content, that is what you want to say, but your audience determines certain specifics about the content and the way you deliver it. If you're not concerned about your audience, if all you want to do is say what you want to say, then without meaning to offend anyone, I think that you should consider writing a journal. There are places around that will publish what you want, but it will cost you a lot of money, which you will probably not recover. Every story worth publishing is a universal story told from an author's unique perspective. Your editor can help you tell your unique story from a universal perspective. The point is that determining your audience is one of those things that an editor can help you define. Who does the editor work for? Now, this might seem like an odd question, but really what I'm asking is, who is the editor accountable to? Well, in a publishing house, the editor is accountable to the publisher, obviously. The publisher is the person who thinks about things like, well, audience, marketing, but from a marketing perspective. They think about the format of the book, they think about the cover art, they think about the title, they think about the business end of writing. If you're self-publishing, I would argue that you are still accountable to the publisher. What I mean by that is that when you're self-publishing, you are wearing the hats of the author and the publisher, as well as the publicist, the art director, the illustrator, the permissions expert, and so on. So when you are hiring and working with an editor, you have to take off your author hat and put on your publisher hat. A publisher wants editors to balance sensitivity with honest critique, because writers are the heart of their business. But they need to keep readers happy, because readers are the bottom line of their business. So when you're hiring an editor, you need to look for someone that you as an author feel comfortable with, but you also need to look for someone who will take you beyond your comfort zone. Finally, you need to look for someone who will constantly remind you to keep your readers in mind. Another moment for humor and for questions, if there are any.
No, we don't have any questions. So you can just plow ahead.
Okay. So what do editors do more specifically? Well, editors bring fresh, experienced eyes to your project. Editors understand publishing, and they also understand writing, and they can look at your work more objectively than you can. Editors work for the publisher, but with the author, which is what makes it so tricky in a self-publishing situation. In this book, with the cover I'm showing, it describes an editor and author who have worked together for many years. The editor has helped the author develop books from the ground up and even choose what's going to be his next book to write. And a close friendship has evolved. The author-editor relationship might not always be so easy. Consider this excerpt from an article in the New York Times in 2015, and I will give you a couple of minutes to read this on your own. I will say that beyond this quote, the author goes on to say that every time he received one of her editorial letters, he spends the first day raging and tantruming like a 5-year-old. He spends the second day licking his wounds, and on the third day, he realizes she's right, and he sits down and gets down to work. And because of that, Green's novel, this particular novel, stayed on the bestseller list for years. It had more than 18.5 million copies in print worldwide. It was adapted into a feature film. In other words, it made him wealthy and gave him renown. You don't need to expect that a freelance editor you hire is going to offer such stinging critique. I think that if we did that we probably wouldn't have clients for very long. There's a big difference between working with a huge publishing house and a small one, and between working with a huge publisher and a freelance editor. But you do have to be open to criticism, because the editor really does have your book's best interests at heart. You can always find someone who will quote you bottom dollar and whisper sweet nothings at your manuscript and perhaps at you as well, and there may very well be a place for that. But if you're serious about producing the best work you can, you need to learn to take constructive criticism. I'm currently working with 2 authors on a developmental edit, and I'll explain what that is in a couple of minutes. And they are both, they're retired, they have interesting stories to tell, and neither one of them has ever written before. And the editing process or the coaching process with them has been difficult but fun, because they have embraced the constructive criticism instead of taking it personally. And their books are much better for it. Now, I can't promise that anybody's book is ever going to make it past a junior editor's slush pile, but you have a much better chance if you learn to take that constructive criticism and use it. Now, here are a few resources on the author-editor relationship. Of course, don't worry about writing them down, because you'll be getting a PDF and the recording of this webinar. Anna, any questions at this point?
Yes, we do. Just one moment. We have a question here. Interesting points. Would you discuss these points with the client prior to initiating the project? Could we assume that the client is open to discussing these roles, editor, publisher, writer, etc.? I am wondering how much time a preamble with a client might take prior to going ahead and initiating a project.
Good question. I think that in my experience, you have to sort of feel things out as you go along. I would never throw too much information at a potential client right at the front end. But I do need to have a fairly frank conversation with people about being able to respond. And usually that takes the form, or often that takes the form of performing a sample edit for them. So then they can see exactly what my style is. There are writers who will not hire me after they've seen my sample edit because they don't really want to be criticized. They want to be flattered. They want to be told everything is perfect. Or despite the fact that I do my best to be diplomatic, they may find my style too direct. I do work very hard at being tactful, but my style of communication is quite direct. And the only thing that I can say to that is that you need to keep looking. We will come later in the presentation to how to go about hiring an editor. And one of the most important points is allowing enough time to find out if the editor is a person that you are going to be able to work comfortably with. Does that answer the questioner's question?
I'm not sure. Just one moment, we'll see. Can you, yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, good.
And the second question we have here is, how often do you get pushback from writers when you edit their work? How frequent are those who are a little separate from their work and focused on making it better? That doesn't, I'm sorry, Deanna, that doesn't make...
No, I get it.
Okay.
I think I understand what she's asking.
All right.
A lot. And I don't have a problem with that. Every piece of writing, every book manuscript certainly is a labor of love on the part of the author. And it's really important to respect that. And it's also important to respect that regardless of what you or I think of what they've done as editors, it's their book. And you have to get to a point as an editor where you are able to let that go. You know, at the end of the day, it's their book, and as long as they are paying you appropriately for your work, then that's that. Generally, what I find, for example, with the two authors I'm currently working with, they are both open to criticism. They will push back when they have something to explain. And sometimes what that means is that I've misunderstood or I've misinterpreted, in which case I'll say that and say, but you know, if I can misunderstand or misinterpret, so can your readers. So what can we do to make this clearer? Sometimes it means that they have an idea about what they want to present and the way they want to present it. And I need to take them back to fundamental questions like, who is your audience? Is this really going to reach your audience? Something we haven't discussed yet is narrative arc. You know, does this fit in with your narrative arc? More often than not, I am able to persuade an author of the things that are most important. But there are occasions where I just say, okay, this is the way you want it. It's your book. And every once in a while, I've had a situation where I have just finally had to let a client go. I've had to say to them, look, you're pushing back against me so much here that I just honestly think that maybe we're not a very good fit as a writing and editing team. So I you know, I thank you for giving me a try, and I wish you better luck with your next editor. You just have to find a way to be diplomatic about letting people go if they're going to push back that much. I think that answers the question. Are there any others?
No, there are not.
Okay, let's power right along here. What type of editing do you need? Well, There are many different types of editing, and only an editor is going to be able to recommend what will serve you and your work best. We're going to move into some fairly dry material now, but knowing these terms will be invaluable to you when you try to talk to an editor and hire an editor. Again, don't worry about writing these things down as you'll receive the PDF, but do make note of any questions. I'll pause about halfway through because this is the longest part of the presentation, and then again at the end of this portion of the presentation. The main types of editing include developmental or project editing, which takes a project from concept through development and into a completed manuscript. Manuscript evaluation or assessment evaluates an existing manuscript and assesses the strengths that are there for the author to build on and the areas for improvement. And just going back a moment to Deanna's question, this is a key point in any editing, is that if the critiques are well woven with acknowledgement of the areas where the author is doing well, then the critiques will go down a lot better. Structural or substantive editing may reorganize a manuscript, or may involve, reorganizing a manuscript or recommending other large-scale changes. Stylistic or line editing works with flow of sentences, paragraphs, and chapters. Copy editing concerns mechanical issues such as grammar, punctuation, spelling, and syntax. Proofreading is a final look to catch anything missed during the copy edit, as well as presentation issues that may arise during layout, widows, orphans, and so on. And if anybody wants the definitions for widows and orphans, then please feel free to ask during the question break. Developmental or project editing. Now we're going to go into each of these major types of editing in a little bit more detail. So this is coordinating or editing a project from proposal or rough draft through to finished manuscript. It includes incorporating input from authors, consultants, and reviewers. It may include budgeting, hiring, design, and supervision, and project coordination. Examples of when I would use, when I would recommend developmental or project editing include when an author has a good idea but doesn't know how to start, and when the author is partway through a manuscript but is kind of stuck. And I would say that both of the authors I'm working with right now came to me in one of these situations. Manuscript evaluation or assessment. This is when an editor reviews a manuscript for reading level, use of literary devices, character and plot development, point of view, dialogue and interior monologue, description and imagery, structure and transitions, narrative arc. And it typically also includes a read-through with marginalia, a short summary of strengths and challenges, recommendations for improvement, and sometimes a short sample edit. Some editors will do that voluntarily for free, others will do it for free if asked, others yet will charge. Structural or substantive editing. Clarifying or reorganizing a manuscript for content and structure. This can be a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. I often recommend starting with a manuscript evaluation, which is less expensive, faster, and can kickstart the author into another draft. I had an example of this a couple of years ago. An author who had received his master's degree in philosophy wanted to turn his thesis into a book, which is not an uncommon market for editors. But by the time he came to me, he had been working on it for so long, as you can imagine, that he was just too tired to keep going. I strongly recommended a manuscript evaluation. He said he just wanted somebody to take over and do the rest of it for him. But just because of circumstances, I needed to edit the book in 2 parts. So I did the first half over a 2-week period, and then I had to meet a commitment to another client. And then he was supposed to come back for another 2-week period about a month later. Well, by the time he worked his way through the changes I'd suggested to the first half of the book, he'd become so re-energized by the new ideas that I brought to him, because I hadn't been thinking about this for the last 3 years, that he was ready to charge off. He ended up taking the next year to rewrite the second half of the book, and did finally come back to me. But you know, in that situation, it really would have been wiser for him to have a manuscript evaluation, and it would have cost him significantly less as well. I'll stop here and take some questions if there are any, Anna.
No, there are not.
Okay. Stylistic or line editing includes, for example, clarifying meaning, eliminating jargon, smoothing language. As negotiated with the editor, it may include checking or correcting reading level, creating or recasting tables or figures. Authors often think they're ready for a copy edit when what they need is a stylistic edit. It is sometimes possible to combine the two to reduce costs. Excuse me. Copy editing. For example, this is editing for grammar, spelling, punctuation, typos, correct verb conjugation, and consistent use of person, subject-verb agreement, appropriate word usage, internal consistency of facts, which is separate from external fact-checking, recasting run-on sentences, dividing lengthy paragraphs, checking headers for accuracy and position within information hierarchy, marking header levels and approximate placement of art, checking accuracy and consistency of tables, charts, and graphs, and notifying the designer of unusual production requirements. As you've noticed, this is a pretty complex stage just because it's a pickier stage. Copy editing may also include negotiating with the editor for Canadianization, metrication, providing or changing a system of citations, writing or editing captions or credit lines, writing running heads. I just could go on and on. Copy editing is often loosely used to include stylistic and even structural editing, fact-checking, and markup. This is not the way Editors Canada uses it, but it is the way many publishing houses use it. Copy editing is also often confused with proofreading, the distinction being that copy editing happens before layout and usually in a program like Word, where you can make large-scale changes and track them. And proofreading happens after layout. Proofreading includes reviewing proofs of an edited and laid out manuscript. This may include both galley proofing and page proofing. Galley proofing may include incorporating or exercising discretion on author's alterations. I'll just let you read this as I bring them up. For a complete list of editing skills, please visit Editors Canada. There are definitions of all the major editorial skills and some less major ones, I guess, such as picture research. And again, you don't need to worry about writing that URL down because you will be receiving the PDF. That was a lot of information, and I raced through some of it. Are there any questions on that?
There is one. Up
Okay.
to. I'm just finishing my master's in philosophy, so my ears perked up. Is there much of a market for editing academic work or philosophy in general?
Well, I can't respond to the part about philosophy in general, but I can certainly say that there is a huge market for editing academic work. There are many, many members of Editors Canada who make their living that way, almost entirely. And that includes editing essays at the undergraduate level. It includes editing theses and dissertations. It includes editing theses and dissertations to convert them into book form. And it also includes when academics, professional academics, write papers for peer-reviewed journals. So yes, if you are an aspiring editor, there are lots of opportunities. There are certain things that are specific to doing academic editing, certain ethical guidelines that you need to follow, and Editors Canada has a printout about that. But it is a very good market for editors, and if as an aspiring author, if you're finishing your master's degree, as you say, you want to find an editor, you really should have your pick. There are many, many editors in Canada who do precisely that kind of work. Anything else?
Another question here is, as an editor, how long do you take to decide what the client needs?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, you need to strike a balance because on the one hand, there are so many times when you start a project and you get into it and you realize that it needs something more or different than what you thought, even from a sample edit. But on the other hand, it's not really fair to you as an editor or to the client to spend too much time. Obviously, the client wants to move forward, and obviously you can't, in pragmatic terms, invest too much time in figuring out what a project is going to need without being paid anything for it. It's simply not realistic. So for me, when I receive a request, and then there's also the complication of, you know, how busy are you when the request comes in, and that's always a tricky one to juggle, because, you know, you as a freelancer, you have to keep on marketing even when you're really busy doing the work you have, or you won't end up having work once you finish the work you have. So you have to find some kind of balance, and I don't know if there are any particular tricks or tips I would offer about that. It's just mostly a matter of coming to it in your own practice, that you have to respond to authors in a reasonable period of time, and you have to look at their work enough to get a good idea of what they need. But you also have to, and I recommend to everyone who's freelancing, and this is as much benefit to people on the editing side of the relationship as on the client side of the relationship. Write an agreement, have a contract, put it down in words, make sure that it's clear what you are going to do. We will come to something about this a little bit later in the presentation, but there needs to be something built in there into that agreement to say, you know, if the work turns out to need substantially more than you have estimated, then you will not go ahead and do that work without consulting the client. You will talk to them about it at the first opportunity, and you will figure out a way to move forward, whether that means they're going to stop the project, they're going to look for another editor, or you're going to reduce the amount of work you do and still charge the same price, or you are going to go ahead with the things that you are recommending and they're okay with paying more. But yeah, that's a very good question, and it is a tricky balance. I hope that answers it adequately. And if it doesn't, then please feel free to contact me later. Are there any other questions, Anna?
Not at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. So when should you hire an editor? And by this, I mean, at what point in your process? Realistically, you can hire an editor anytime before the book goes to print, and this was the case with the friend I mentioned earlier who brought me in to proofread her novel at the 11th hour. That having been said, you really want to start doing your search for an editor as early as possible in your creative process. You want to do this because you need to allow time to plan editing into your budget and your schedule. You also need time for editors to plan it into their schedules. I can tell you firsthand that there are times when I have work lined up 4 months to 6 months in advance, and that's not uncommon for really experienced editors. That said, there are also times, like right now during the pandemic, when if you contacted me, well, actually I had a client contact me the other day and I'm available virtually immediately. But this also ties into the next point, which is that you need to allow time to check out different editors. If you are contacting an editor at the 11th hour, even if you're contacting more than one, then you may end up in a situation where you find, say you narrow your search down to 2 editors, and you really prefer the one, but they're not available to work for you for another 6 months, and you're under some kind of time constraints. The other editor you don't like as well, and maybe they even charge more, but they're available immediately. What do? You know, you've kind of restricted your own options in that situation. So allowing enough time gives you the option to check out different editors before you get down to work. It also gives you time to plan to work with different editors at different stages of your project. Now this is something that typically happens in publishing houses, that there will be one editor who does the structural edit and perhaps the stylistic edit with the author, and then another person who does the copy editing, and a final person who does the proofreading. And this relates in part to, well, okay, probably mostly to the point I mentioned earlier about, you know, when the same person looks at the same work repeatedly, they stop seeing the mistakes. And this goes both in terms of copy editing errors and also in terms of larger scale errors, such as where an argument you're making doesn't make as much sense as it should, or where there are gaps in content, or where the content is repeated in some way. If you plan to work with different editors at different stages, if you have the resources to do that, your book will thank you. Your readers will thank you in the long run. That having been said, I have worked with many authors at multiple stages simply because once they get comfortable with me, they want to stick with me. So typically in those situations, I will do the structural, stylistic copy editing and then find someone else to do the proofreading, just to make sure that they have another pair of eyes on it at the 11th hour. And you can only do that if you've allowed enough time to find different people who you'd like to work with. And that's the point. Setting a production schedule in advance can help ensure you have enough time for proper editing. Are there any questions on that?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
So Sharon asks, how small or large should a sample edit be? For instance, how many pages? How much should you expect to pay for it? And could you pay for the sample edit as part of the overall cost of hiring the editor if you agree to go with him or her?
Okay, that's a big question and a good one. Different editors have different guidelines, and I will come to my guidelines later. I generally ask for 2,000 words. I don't go by pages because, you know, depending on spacing and font size, that can be a very different length of time. 2,000 words, and I specify that they need to be taken from the center of the manuscript, whereas some other editors will say, give me 2,000 words, but I want 1,000 words from 2 different sections of the manuscript. The reason for that is that you need enough of a sample in front of you to get a good idea of what the sample represents. And you also need it you need it in a way that you can look at and understand that this is a representative sample. So, for example, I edited a book a number of years ago, and I accepted a sample that was the introduction. The introduction was really well written. As the book progressed, the writing got worse and worse. There was less and less research. It was, I ended up, the client wasn't happy because they ended up having to pay a lot more, but really it was their own responsibility for sending me a sample edit that was not at all representative of the writing in the book overall. I'm sorry, Anna, can you read back the subsequent parts of that question?
Right. And how much should you expect to pay for it? Could you pay for the sample as part of the overall cost of hiring the editor you agree to go with?
Okay. I generally do a sample edit for free if the client asks. I did reach a point with one client a number of years ago where she had endless stages that she wanted me to go through. I mean, I basically put in almost a week's work just trying to get a project that was going to pay me enough for 2 weeks' work. And that's not reasonable. That's not a reasonable thing for a client to ask. So I will generally do a sample edit for free. Some editors will charge, if it's 2,000 words, they might charge, I'm not even really sure because I don't do it, $100, $200. I don't think that I would pay more than $1 a word for a sample. And most of the time, I would really question an editor that would charge for the sample and then not deduct that portion from, if you choose them, from the cost of the overall manuscript. So for example, if you paid them $200 to edit a 2,000 word sample and they estimated $2,000 for the whole manuscript, well, you've already paid them $200. So really what you're going to end up paying is $1,800. If an editor is not willing to do that, then seriously, I would look for another editor. And I hope that answers that question. Is there anything else?
Yes, we have a few questions here. Stephanie asks, what is the likelihood of multiple editors working on a project? Does the editor speak with the client to find out where the original editor ended things, or is there a better process than starting over?
I'm sorry, I'm not really understanding that question.
I think that, and Stephanie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she wants to know what happens if an editor comes in after another editor has left the project, and is there a way to go about starting where that editor left off, or better than beginning all over again?
Oh, that's difficult. Yes, of course. If it's necessary for one editor to step in where another left off, it is possible, but it is difficult. And honestly, depending on the situation, I don't know if I would recommend it. And the reason I say that is because different editors, like different writers, have very different styles of editing. And it's not that easy for an editor to mimic another editor's style, particularly if the other editor uses points of style that the second editor is really not comfortable with. You can always ask. You know, I'm sure there are editors out there who are willing to accommodate as much as possible. But there are, I guess the upshot is, yes, it's possible to not go back to the beginning and start over. I think if I were in that situation of being the second editor, what I would want to do is perhaps go over what the previous editor has done and check back in with the author about any minor changes I might want to make to their style so that it would mesh better with my style. I think that's the best I can do with that question. But good question.
Okay, and I've got another here. What type of ethical issues have you encountered with clients, if any, and how have you addressed these issues?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, that client I mentioned a few minutes ago who sent me the introduction that was very well written, and then the rest of the book was not well written. Let's just leave it at that. 30% of the text of that book turned out to have been plagiarized. And I discovered this because as I was going through the manuscript, I realized that there were parts of it where editing was like pulling teeth. It took me an hour or two to get through a single page. And then I'd hit a part where it was really flowing and smooth. And this was happening often. So I finally started cutting and pasting larger and larger chunks of text into Google, and I would come up with, 5, 10, 12 places on the web that these exact same words appeared. What I said to that author was that I can't do that. I went to my online editors group and I asked their opinion, and they all agreed that that was simply not an ethical expectation from the author. And I went back to my author, and as tactfully as possible, I said, you can't do this. This is in fact illegal. You are asking me to edit plagiarized writing. And, it's not necessarily that the content is wrong or bad. I didn't say this to him, but in fact, the writing was typically better than his. But it had to be, at the very least, paraphrased. The author had to come up with different words. And if the author didn't want to come up with different words, then I would have to come up with different words, and that would cost an additional sum. So that was one ethical situation I had. I'm trying to think if there were others. I'm sure there have been. Oh, yes, actually there was. I had an ethical situation with a woman who had me editing her dissertation. And I had not done a lot of academic editing at the point. And there are some fairly strict guidelines around academic editing that basically an academic editor does copy editing or proofreading. They cannot do stylistic or substantive work because those levels of production are levels that the student is being tested on in their dissertation or thesis. And there was a tremendous amount of creep. This was much earlier in my editing career. there was a significant amount of scope creep from copy editing first into stylistic editing, and then at a certain point into substantive editing. And that did not go well. The client was not happy to hear that. She has some pretty unrealistic expectations to begin with, such as not actually finishing her dissertation until and getting the copy to me until just a few days before it was due to be submitted. And unfortunately, that contract ended on a not very happy note, with her suggesting to me that maybe she wouldn't pay me what she owed me. And unfortunately, what I had to say to her was, you know, I can go to your advisors and let them know what you're doing here. And that might not be very good for you. And that was the way that ended. I wished that it could have ended better than that, and I tried to bring it to a happier ending than that. But at some points, as a professional, you just have to say what you have to say and move on. Any other questions, Anna?
Yes, and if we could move along a little bit quicker because we are running out of time. This is
okay.
We're already at 2:05, so we only have 25 minutes left. I don't know how many slides do we have left?
Not many. We're through most of it.
Okay, well then good to know. Okay, Dalton asks, as an editor, where or how else do you market yourself? As you earlier mentioned, does some or much of your work come from repeat clients or word of mouth referrals? In other words, where do your clients find you?
Well, I have a website. I'm on social media on several outlets. I don't always know where they come from. I have colleagues who will sometimes refer work to me. Some of the work that I do is responding to RFPs for government work or corporate work. When I'm going through a slow period, I will do things like this. I'll give workshops and seminars. And I sometimes get clients that way. I contact publishers. When I was first trying to get work with conventional publishers, a young colleague said to me one of the best ways to get in with publishers is to first of all read books from their backlist, and then go to author launches and make a point of approaching somebody from the publishing house, whether it's the managing editor or the publisher themselves, and introducing yourself and talking about books from their backlist and just making yourself known that way. There are probably other things I do, but I can't really think of them at the moment. I didn't really gear this presentation that way, so I hope that helps.
Okay, and that's a big thank you. And we have another question on the Q&A and then a couple on the chat. So Dennis asks follow-up to Sharon's question about the sample edits. And what if after an editor has done all that work on a sample edit, the client decides thanks, but no thanks? Surely you would charge for them then, for the sample then.
If I've told them that I'll give them a sample edit, then I give them a sample edit, a free sample edit. And yes, it's extremely annoying when they don't follow up, but I have had that happen, and it happens. It's one of the risks that an editor takes when they offer a free sample edit. And it's also one of the reasons why, you know, referring back to an earlier question, why you don't want the time that you spend with a manuscript before actually getting a signed agreement in place to be too much. I have had situations where I have given people free advice because they absolutely promised me on their mother's grave that they were going to hire me. And then at the 11th hour, they just ducked out and disappeared. And I mean, it's just a lesson learned, you know, no matter, usually it's because I think they have a really interesting project or a really worthwhile project. But I've learned from hard experience. Limit the amount of time that I spend on marketing myself to any particular author. And, you know, then I just, if after I've invested time, they don't come to me, they don't give me a job, I meditate. I guess that's all I can say. Or maybe drink a good stiff martini.
Okay, so on that note, we'll go to the chat. There are a couple of things in here. Just one second. Here, Catherine asks, can you do different types of editing at the same time? Stylistic editing, copy editing, etc.
No. There have been times when, for the sake of saving a client money, I have tried to combine levels of editing. And, you know, to some extent, I will combine a little bit of stylistic editing with copy editing, or substantive editing with stylistic, or copy editing with, you know, doing copy editing at the proofreading stage. The thing is that the lines between these levels of editing are not hard and fast. They're quite fluid. So most of the time, I would say, when an editor is doing one kind of editing, they're probably also doing a little bit of another type of editing. But to just plan overall that you're going to combine copy editing and proofreading, it's not a good plan. There are too many things that come up during a copy edit that are too difficult to deal with at the proofreading stage after layout has been done. For example, to try and do a substantive edit at the same time as you're doing a copy edit, well, there is a really big difference between those two types of editing. A substantive edit is looking at the very big picture and, you know, thinking about organization, thinking about gaps in the information, thinking about redundancies. Whereas a copy editing, you know, the reason there are so many bullets on the list for copy editing is that there is so much to be done, and it's all at a very fine level. And one of the things that, you know, again, we're talking about the human brain. You know, it's not necessarily that the right and left hemispheres are absolutely clearly divided. But the truth is that we have one part of our brain, or certain parts of our brain, that are creative, and certain other parts of our brain that are logical. And trying to combine those two things is exceedingly difficult. And for my money, it is just bound to lead to problems in the edited manuscript.
Okay, and just this one last thing. We have a large comment here. However, I think that the basis of it is what do you do? And if you could answer this briefly, what do you do when you've got a client you've worked with and then they come back over time here and there? How's this? Can you just take a look at this sentence? Blah blah blah. Over time, that becomes extremely onerous. What do you do then?
I don't do that. I just don't do that.
You put an end to it right away.
I'm sorry?
You put an end to it right away, right at the beginning?
Yes. I have made the mistake of allowing people who have promised me their business to do that up front, which I don't do anymore. But once a contract has finished, if they want anything more from me, I will tell them, you know, no, I'm not going to fix a particular sentence because it's not going to be one sentence. there will be other sentences. And if you want me to give it another pass, then we need to negotiate another agreement.
Yeah, I don't think that this is all about just the same work. It's just about different pieces of work that the client, that the original client may come back because they say they trusted you and they trust your opinion. Oh, I'm doing something else. How about this sentence? How about that sentence?
No, I wouldn't edit on that basis. I mean, I'm very glad when a client is really happy with my work and they want to come back to me, but no, I will not do work for them, you know, just a little bit here and there on any project. If they want to hire me, then I need to look at their manuscript, I need to give them an estimate, and then they hire me for a new project.
Okay, and then I just one last question here, and then we should move on. Not to be crass, but what do you charge for the various types of editing that you do? I've looked online and the rates seem to vary widely, even within each category. Can I assume the amount an editor charges is an indication of how good or how experienced they are?
Okay, well, first of all, my answer to that last part of the question would be no, you can't. There are a lot of factors that go into how much an editor charges, and that is actually part of the presentation. I'm going to come to that shortly.
Okay, great. So let's move on.
Where can you find a good editor? I'll start trying to power through this because we are running out of time. Where can you find an editor and how do you know if they're good? Well, my first recommendation, if you're in Canada, is go to Editors Canada. The thing is, anyone can call themselves an editor. It's not a regulated profession, but not anyone can be a member of Editors Canada, which is the national organization for professional editors, both in-house and freelance. Editors Canada offers a lot of professional development opportunities, which include but are not limited to certification courses at each of 4 major levels of editing, which include structural, stylistic, copy editing, and proofreading. And once a candidate has completed all 4 of those exams, they can use the designation Certified Professional Editor. So that is one way to find a good editor. But not every editor has their CPE. I don't have mine. I had a choice between pursuing my CPE or going for a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction Writing, and I chose the master's degree. I would probably like to do my CPE at some point, but so far it hasn't been realistic. Not all editors are member of Editors Canada. I know some very good editors and work with some very good editors who are not members. And then there are editors who have been editing for so long that they are charter members of Editors Canada, and they were on the committee that created the whole certification program. So there are other ways that you can check for competence. And as you see in front of you, you can go to Editors Canada's website and you can search their online directory of editors. You can post a listing on their national job board. If you're in BC, you can email BC hotline at editors.ca to post an ad and expect to be flooded with responses. You can search for someone online, and when you find them, you can ask about their credentials. Are they a member of Editors Canada or an equivalent organization in their jurisdiction? For example, there's a separate professional editors body on Vancouver Island. You can ask them if they have their CPE or if they have courses or certification from recognized institutions, such as I have an editing certificate from SFU. I believe Ryerson has a program. I believe Douglas College has a program. I think Humber College has a program. So, you know, you can ask about official credentials. Another way to suss somebody out is to find out their familiarity with different style guides. There are many. Probably the main one used in trade book publishing is the Chicago Manual of Style, but there are many others, the APA, Associated Press, Canadian Press, many style guides. And if an editor is not familiar with, I would say at a bare minimum, 3 or 4 of them, then I would look for somebody else. You can also ask for references, you know, and as references typically go, you want to ask for somebody who has a project where the editor was editing a work that has some overlap with yours. So it's nonfiction, it's in a similar genre, maybe on a similar topic, and you can get some information that way. And last but not least, as we've discussed, you can ask for a sample edit and be prepared that there may be a fee, and decide whether you're willing to pay that. Now, how should you prepare your manuscript for editing? This is important. An editor stares at a computer screen for hours every day looking for details. It's hard on the eyes, the brain, and the posture. It's much easier for editors to clean up your words if you clean up all the surface clutter first. It's also less time consuming for the editor and therefore less expensive for you. And when I'm talking about surface clutter, I'm remembering a project a number of years ago. It was an anthology and it was for a publisher, and the publisher had not bothered to make sure that every contribution had all the styles stripped out so that the whole book was in the same font. The whole book had similar types of spacing. That kind of thing it just adds minutes, and minutes add up into more work and more time for the editor. So what exactly should you submit? Double space your manuscript and leave 1-inch margins all around. Use spell check and grammar check. And no, believe me, you are not doing the editor's job. Use Word's built-in styles to format your manuscript consistently. This can help them see what your idea is of your information hierarchy. And if they don't have to create your information hierarchy as part of their job, then, you know, it's just a matter of determining whether you've always done it the best way. But that having been said, avoid bells and whistles. They only clutter the page. And by that, I mean, you know, don't try to be fancy with word art or something like that. Yeah, that is just too much. If you plan to submit your manuscript to an agent or publisher, or if you plan to self-publish, you're going to have to learn to do all these things anyways, so why not now? This actually addresses the point that the question that I responded to a few minutes ago about combining levels of editing. You know, in Hemingway's, Hemingway has one approach, and Stephen King has a less alcoholic approach. Are there any questions at this point?
We do have one. And
okay.
It's for aspiring editors just starting out with 30 to 40 years ahead of them. Any insights for skills they need to be successful in this dynamic profession?
Oh, wow.
Grammar would be one.
Grammar would be good. An understanding of punctuation, familiarity with style guides. When I first started focusing on editing, I sat down and read the Chicago Manual of Style from front to back and made notes on it. And I did the same with the MLA style guide and the APA style guide. It was dry and it was boring, but it was worth it. Take grammar courses. Go to professional development workshops and seminars. Plan to be doing professional development throughout your career. Get some kind of certification. Take a certificate program somewhere. You're not allowed to take the CPE to start doing the CPE exams. I think you might have to double check on this until you've been in the profession for a few years. But once you are eligible to take CPE exams, do. I haven't taken the exams, but I've marked some at the copy editing level, and I was amazed at how much I didn't know. They are extremely difficult exams, and you will learn a lot. And I guess that has to be the main thing that I would say is go out, get yourself as much education as you can right at the start, and don't ever stop. Don't ever stop. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. And just as an addition, it really does depend on the type of editing that you are looking to do. If you're looking to
Yes.
do creative editing, books and such for fiction and fantasy and along those lines, you might want to do creative writing certificates or something like that.
That and also what I mentioned earlier about you know, finding publishers that you would like to work for. Read lots. You can't be a writer or an editor if you don't read. So read the kind of work that you want to work on, and go to book launches, talk to other people in the publishing industry. To me, that's all part of education.
Okay, so that's it. You can go on.
Okay. What should you expect from an editor? Expect a good editor to spend time with your work. If someone tells you that they're going to be able to edit a 50,000 word novel in a week, find someone else. Expect to include editing in your budget from the beginning. I touched on this one earlier. Expect good editors to have busy schedules and include enough time in your schedule to allow editors to fit you into theirs. I also touched on that one earlier. Expect or request a written agreement spelling out exactly what you're giving and getting. I used to work without a written agreement, and I had some problems, notably with the dissertation client that I mentioned earlier. And since then, I don't do anything without a written agreement. You can buy this book, produced and sold by Editors Canada, from their website, and it will give you a very good idea of what to look for. Not everyone is a member of Editors Canada, so not everyone is going to adhere to these standards, but this will give you some background as to what to talk about and how to talk about it when you're negotiating with an editor. And it will also help you determine what particulars you want to include in that written and signed agreement. The style sheet is a really good thing to expect from an editor. Editing is an art, not a science, so there are always choices to make. It's standard practice for an editor to say which style guide and dictionary they'll use, or to ask if you have a preference. Most trade publishers use the Chicago Manual, which is the most comprehensive as far as I'm aware. Some Canadian publishers use CP style, some scholarly publishers prefer APA. And then as well as that, most publishing houses or academic publishers or whatever have their own house style. And the house style will indicate the style guide and dictionary, whether they use the Oxford comma or not. It will list spellings of words and proper nouns and so on. But over and above that, every manuscript has its own idiosyncrasies. And this will arise particularly in the academic field, where there's a lot of jargon that differs from one field to another. Your editor should record all the idiosyncrasies of your manuscript on a style sheet. And I mentioned academics, but this really applies across the board. With this style sheet, they can keep track of the multitude of decisions they make as they go along. You can understand why they've done the things they have, and anyone who does a subsequent edit knows what to do for consistency. I do love Stephen King. Questions?
No, and we
Okay.
only have a few minutes left. So
Okay.
Are we close to ending?
What should you pay an editor? I'm going to go into some math here, and I'm going to run through it very quickly. If you pay an editor $500 to edit your manuscript, how much time can you expect them to invest? An editor who gets a manuscript every week for 50 weeks of the year, assuming that they take a vacation, is earning only $24,000 before taxes and expenses. That's not much for a professional with one or more university degrees, as well as other certificates and diploma and years of experience. It may sound like a lot of money when an editor says to you that they need $2,000 or $3,000. But if you have invested hundreds of hours in your manuscript, why wouldn't you want to hire an editor who can do it justice? An editor may also know the market better and know what factors into your bottom line. And there are lots of places actually where you can find information on what to charge. There's a very interesting blog post at peerlessprose.com if you just search for editing fees. And on her website, she also links to a couple of other places that give you some advice in this area. So what should you pay? Rates vary widely depending on the type of work and the editor's experience. Science editors are probably going to charge more than, I don't know, some other editors. The Editors Canada website suggests rates for various types of work. You can also contact any editor and find out what they charge and whether they charge by the page, the word, or the hour. All of that having been said, editors typically recognize their clients' constraints and are open to negotiation. If you want to speak to me about my rates and my parameters, please contact me directly. My contact information is at the end of the presentation. What other services do editors provide? And this is the last slide. Indexing, formatting, picture research, mentoring, creating ebooks, design and layout, ghostwriting, website development, marketing and publicity, research permissions, etc., and so on. The value adds an editor can bring to your work are virtually endless. I used to have a colleague who was a very accomplished needle worker, and she had the ability to edit knitting instructions. I can't even imagine that. That's completely beyond me. But there are people out there who have just an amazing range of skills that they can bring to your work. A closing thought and final questions.
Actually, Lynn, we don't have any other questions.
Okay.
In the chat, a lot of people have expressed their gratitude for your candor and your in-depth answers to their questions. I want to thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this. And remember that we will be sending out a survey very soon. I would appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to just fill that out. And you will be receiving the PDF, the PowerPoint, and the video. We do apologize for the little glitch at the beginning with the slides, but you will have those slides so you can match the two. Thank you so much. And that ends the presentation. Thank you, Lynn.
Yes, thank you all for attending. I've enjoyed doing this.
Okay. Oh, wait.
Oh, a question.
What? Oh, no, it just says thanks to both of you. Okay, thank you, Lucy. And yeah, that's the end. And we're just going to cut it off now. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good day and stay safe.
Stay safe.